So today we're going to be covering sensory reactivity and anxiety in children. Now we know 8 in 10 autistic children and adults experience the sensory world differently. And we know that that can lead to people feeling pretty overwhelmed with the world as it is. And we're starting to understand the impact that that can have on children and adults' mental health. So that's why today we've invited Dr. Teresa Tavassoli to talk about the topic. She's a researcher and an associate professor at the University of Reading, and she's currently working on a research project that's actually funded by Autistica and by the charity MQ, and it's focusing on sensory reactivity and anxiety in autistic children. And obviously the hope is that with this knowledge that we can help to understand how we can better support autistic children in the future. So the format for today, it's an hour-long webinar. Teresa is going to talk for about 30 minutes. And then after that, we will have about 20 minutes, and depending on how much time we've got left, for audience Q&A. So if you have questions, you can add them at any point in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on Facebook, you can just add a comment. Please feel free to join in the chat as well. Let us know who you are, where you come from. Really helps us to understand who's joining. We know we've got parents and professionals, so we'd love to hear from you. And then we'll close the webinar at 2 p.m. So over to you, Teresa.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about sensitivity and anxiety today. Let me share your screen, and thanks to everyone who is attending. Okay, so let me see. So hopefully you're able to see the screen now. Do let me know if you don't see the slides. Yeah, okay, good. So today I'm going to share some of my research as well as others on sensory activity and anxiety and autism. And this is a topic I've been interested in more recently. So my main area is sensory activity. However, in the last few years, I've been more and more interested on the impact of sensory activity differences on mental health, as well as other areas of life. So I will start off with kind of the take-home message, which will come back at the end. I just wanted to do it right at the start when everyone, when everyone's attention is highest. So kind of the take-home messages are, first of all, sensory activity as well as anxiety are very common in autism. Just as Rebecca just said, so about 80–90% of autistic children have sensory activity differences, and about 40% of autistic individuals also have anxiety symptoms. And we also found that sensory activity is linked to anxiety and different anxiety subtypes. And more recent work is showing that sensory hyperreactivity is perceived to precede anxiety. So it seems to be there before anxiety symptoms arrive. And then sensory seeking, so craving sensations from the environment, seem to be more after anxiety and more coping strategy, which is a topic I think we come back throughout the 30 odd minutes that I'm going to talk, is that there are differences in sensory perception, but it could be, some of them might be overwhelming, such as being hyperreactive and overly sensitive to environment, but other aspects, for example, seeking, might also be beneficial. And that could potentially be used for treatments as well. And in general, I think that sensory activity should be considered when someone is looking for a diagnosis of anxiety, as well as when you're looking for interventions. Okay, so first of all, why should we care about sensory activity? I always say, kind of, who could say it better than someone who is autistic? And Temple Grandin is an autistic adult, and she was saying that from as far back as I can remember, I always hated to be hugged. It was like a wave of stimulation. And there is also more work where stakeholders were asked and the community was asked. There was a collaboration with Autistica and other charities asking kind of what research should be done. And they had over 3,000 people being involved. And then there were focus groups and 10 questions were identified. And sensory activity or sensory processing was identified as one of the top research questions. So the question, how can sensory processing in autism be better understood? Sensory activity is also diagnostic criteria for autism. So we have symptoms A and B. Symptoms A are difficulties in social communication and interaction, and symptoms B is about repetitive behaviors. And part of this is hyperreactivity, hypo, or seeking. And hyperreactivity describes someone who is very sensitive to the environment, shows a strong reaction. Hyporeactivity is a slower response, and then seeking is really being fascinated. And I go through each of them now because these are really kind of key terms that I'll come back to throughout the talk. So what is hyperreactivity? Hyperreactivity means a very strong response to sensory stimuli. And for example, this could be unexpected noises, a dog barking, or high-pitched noises such as vacuum cleaners, or bright flickering lights are often described as being overwhelming. For touch, it could be labels in clothes, or for smell, strong smell. So this is across different senses. And Tempegren, also in her book, Thinking in Pictures, which is really actually quite an interesting book, she is describing them as one of the most debilitating symptoms for some children and adults with autism is sensory oversensitivity. And there's also a picture actually of my daughter when she was a little bit younger than now, and she really didn't like any sounds, any loud sounds or unexpected sounds either. So it's relatively common across, so it could be in autistic individuals and individuals who don't have autism, in other neurodevelopmental conditions. Hyperreactivity is seen as well. So for example, ADHD, OCD. So quite a big impact. However, it's only listed in the diagnostic criteria for autism. Okay, so what is hyporeactivity? So that would describe someone who has a very slow response or no response to sensory stimuli. Sometimes it's reported that there might be a diminished response to pain, for example, or if someone is calling them their name, there's no response. It could also be body kind of interoceptions, body sensations such as hunger, or if you're hot or cold, and if it's difficult to tell. And an example here is taken from a book called Sensational Kids by Lucy Miller. And that is saying, so when Jacob was little, he fell down a flight of stairs head first, landing on his cheek. He picked himself up, only a little shaken. Over time, I grew accustomed to his high tolerance of pain. So again, it's describing someone who might not feel that sensation as much as you would expect. Then sensory seeking is describing someone who's really craving sensory stimuli and sensory experiences, really being fascinated. So this could be being fascinated by spinning things, really looking at flickering lights, or craving touch or hugs and really like to touching, for example, soft fabrics as well, or music, playing the same song over and over again. And an example here is again from Sensational Kids, is the boy can climb anything, leaping into space with no regard for the crash at the bottom. So this is just describing different, so we have hyperactivity, hypo, and seeking. And throughout this talk, it could be quite interesting, I think, for yourself to either think about what are sensations in the environment that I really enjoy, which ones are the ones that I don't like and that are bothersome. And you can think about that for yourself or for your child or for someone you might care for. So the prevalence of sensory symptoms is quite high. So research suggests that it's between 60 and 90%. Often this is measured by using questionnaires, and some of you have might to fill out the sensory profile already. So there are items such as, my child responds negatively to unexpected or loud noises, or covering eyes or squints to protect eyes from light. And when using questionnaires, the prevalence is usually about 80-90%. If you're looking into more direct observations, I think the prevalence is more about 60-70%. Okay. So now I'd like to share some of the work that we've been doing. And this is a project that is led by Karen McLennan, my PhD student. And so this is a project where we invited autistic adults to share their experiences with us. And we asked about sensory hyperreactivity, hypo, and seeking. And we had about 90 autistic, we had about 50 autistic adults taking part, and 90% of those said that they are hyperreactive to the environment. And an example for hyperreactivity that was given is the following. I'm touch sensitive. I hate other people touching me. My skin crawls. I sweat excessively and I feel nausea. And then we also asked about hyporeactivity, and about 30% of autistic adults said, yes, I'm hyporeactive. And an example here was, I don't notice until too late that I'm too cold or too hot. And then seeking was endorsed by about 40% of autistic adults. And there the example was, music calms me down when I'm stressed, and I tend to listen to the same song on repeat for hours at a time. So you can see that you see hyperactivity, hypo, and seeking, and these can all occur in the same individual. And for this sample that we had mainly hyperactivity. Okay, so I'd like you to next think about kind of your own sensory experiences, and either you can do that on your computer or your phone. You don't have to do this, obviously, but it would be great if you could share some of your experiences. This is all anonymous. So I'll go to Menti. If you could go to www.menti.com, and I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see the results. Okay. So the first question I wanted to ask you, just to start to get you thinking about your own experiences, or potentially someone you might know. So for hyperreactivity, what aspects of the environment bother you? So if you go to www.menti.com and then you enter the code that I can't see right now because but you should be able to see it. There we go, 38, yes, the one. Oh, there we go. I'll just leave that up for another minute, so to give everyone a chance. Okay, so yeah, light, motion, sound. So sounds could be, sound, noise seems to be quite more general, but also specific sounds like a dog barking or baby crying. My baby is in nursery today, so he won't disturb us, thankfully. Okay, heat, sounds, yeah. Loud conversations. So a lot of it seems to be kind of hyperreactive, like about sounds as well as light. Bright colors, bright patterns, okay. Okay, background noise as well, yeah. Great, no, thank you so much. So these are really good examples, and something that is, I think we see as well a lot in research, and I will share some of the results that we've seen in the study with autistic adults as well. Don't like hugging, yeah. So there's some touch as well. Touch, yeah, seems to be, okay, great. I'm just going to share one more slide where you can enter your sensory experiences. So for sensory seeking, now the question is, rather than not liking something, which aspects of the environment do you seek out? Which aspects of the environment do you really like and enjoy? So for touch, yeah, strong taste. Okay, touch, taste. Music is something we hear actually a lot. Certain colors, okay. Yeah, so there's more here about kind of touch, slime, firm pressure, soft fabric, soft blankets, hugs, hugging. Yeah. Then sounds as well, music, calming music. So also about food and aromatherapy. Great, thank you so much. This could go on for quite a while. I'll leave this open as well, but I will stop sharing this screen and we'll go back to the slides. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. That was really great. Okay. So you should be able to see the slides again. So thanks for sharing. And as mentioned in one of the projects, we also asked autistic adults about their experiences. And here are some examples that were given. And some of these items we also ask in what category do they fall into. So what you can hear or what you see is that it's quite complex, the sensory experiences. For example, for vision, for hyperactivity, autistic adults were saying that bright flashing lights or bright colors patterns can be overwhelming. However, we also had autistic adults saying that they're seeking out bright colors and patterns. And then for hearing, it was about noisy environment, high-pitched sounds, music, and unexpected sound can be hyperactive. And you also mentioned just now, for example, specific sounds like a dog barking or high-pitched sounds as well. And then for seeking, we found more like music that can be calming as well, again, which I think you listed as well. And then for touch, we had for hyperreactivity, it could be if there are pressure differences, certain clothing or labels, and unexpected touch, whereas deep pressure and hugs or soft and fluffy textures. And again, which was really great because you've just mentioned the same thing. So hugs seem to be more an item that is seeked out, as well as certain fabrics or soft fabrics as well. And then we also ask about kind of body awareness, interoception, gustatory is taste, and then smell. And here for hyperreactivity, individuals often say that hot or cold temperatures, as well as changes in weather and pain can be hyperreactive. Then for hyporeactive, we see more pain. But again, hot and cold temperature is for hyper as well as hypo was listed, and seeking out different temperatures. And then for taste, we have spicy food, which also some of you like. I would fall into that category as well. But spicy food can also be for hyperreactive or for seeking. And then for smell, it's often like perfumes. Also, what was quite interesting is pollution was mentioned. And then for seeking, it's kind of fresh air and some certain smells. And I think what we also realized it is a lot of kind of the fresh air or nature images, nature sounds seem to be quite soothing as well overall. So now the question is, so we learned about sensory activity. We learned that we have different types of sensory activity. We can be more sensitive to the environment or less, or we seek out sensations. The question is there a link to anxiety? Or is there a link to any kind of aspect of our daily life? And to give you a very brief overview is there seemed to be a link to different aspects of our life, of our needs. So this is based on a pyramid by Maslow for our basic needs. And I would try to think about how is sensory reactivity linked to these different aspects. So there have been studies linking especially hyperreactivity to sleep and eating difficulties, especially if you're more sensitive to sounds as well as touch. Children as well as adults seem to have more sleeping and eating difficulties. There also have been links to mental health and to anxiety. In particularly, I'm going to over a study by Karen McLennan, my PhD student, that we published last year. And there seems to be links to academic performance as well. In particular, I think that study reported auditory filtering seemed to be linked to more difficulties within a classroom. And some of my projects at the moment are actually looking at the impact of sensory activity and challenging behaviors in classrooms. However, what I would like to go into more depth now is the link to anxiety. So what is anxiety? So in general, anxiety actually can be helpful and it can warn us about danger. However, if it gets too much, that would be then an anxiety disorder or condition. So that shares features of excessive fear and worry. So it has to be anxiety and worry about something that to such a degree that it's getting in the way. So let's say a child is really afraid of so social anxiety, a child is really afraid of other children, and that would stop them from going to a playground, would stop them from going to a party. So it's not necessarily that other children might not play with them, but just the fear of doing something embarrassing or so will stop you from engaging with others. And we see anxiety conditions in about 10 to 20% of the general populations, but in autistic individuals, it seems to be elevated, and about 40% of autistic individuals will get an anxiety disorder at some stage in their lives as well. So it's definitely higher than what you would expect. And more recently, there seems to be more work on how can we disentangle autistic symptoms from anxiety symptoms. And I just wanted to give an example here. So the example I mentioned about kind of social anxiety is that in autism, for example, there might be some difficulties with social communication, and then is someone potentially not interacting with other children because there is the fear of other people, or is it because someone has no interest in interacting with others? And then there's also, for example, specific phobia is one area which is difficult to differentiate. So specific phobia is a fear about a specific object or situation. And this situation has to be actively avoided, and it will cause distress if someone has to experience this. And Connor Kearns has done quite a bit of work on this, and she's describing a case study in one of her papers. So she's saying that someone has sensory issues related to sounds or food from young age, including sensitivities to loud sounds, specific sounds, for example, hairdryer, very picky eating, strong reactions, including nausea to certain foods and smells. So this is not a specific phobia, that's more generally being sensitive to environment. However, in addition to this sensitive reaction to sounds, this person also developed behaved nervously around fire alarms in the local library. So if we have additionally a specific sound, let's say a fire alarm, and an anticipatory element, so someone who starts to be worried about experiencing something in the library or in the school, then there could also be, for example, in addition to being generally more hyperreactive, which is linked to autism, there could also be a specific phobia as well. And that sometimes can be quite tricky to know, is it one or the other, or would it make even sense to add another diagnosis, another label, or potentially it might be more driven by differences we see in autism. Okay, and so as mentioned, Connor Kearns has done quite a bit of work on this, and this is just one study I wanted to present. So she asked about 60 autistic individuals and their parents as well to fill out parent reports. So they asked about sensory as well as anxiety. And here are some example items for the anxiety scale. So for example, when my child feels frightened, it is hard for him or her to breathe. My child gets headaches when she's at school. My child doesn't like to be with people he or she doesn't know well. My child gets scared if he sleeps away from home. So the last one is more separation anxiety and about people's social anxiety. And also what you can see here is that often anxiety in children, you see symptoms more related to behavior. So it could be bodily symptoms like a headache, not feeling well, or children might tell you as well. And I think what we see more sometimes in autistic children as well, who might have only few to no words, where it is a little bit trickier to communicate what is scaring them. I think you sometimes also see temper tantrums just because it's just getting too much. And that's one way to show that this is something that someone is not okay with. And in this study where they ask about sensory activity as well as anxiety, one finding was that autistic children show about 60% of them scored quite high for anxiety, and it was a mix of traditional anxiety as well as they call it atypical anxiety. So this is anxiety that we don't generally see. It could be, let's say, for specific phobias, a general specific phobia. A traditional one would be someone who is afraid of spiders, and a more idiosyncratic specific phobia would be someone who is scared of cartoons on the TV because there is it's the big eyes of the cartoon character. So this was one individual we worked with, where we conducted an interview, and it was this idiot, that kind of an unusual specific phobia to the very large eyes that you see in some characters on in cartoons, and that was so disabling for the child that they wouldn't go to school if they were, because they were scared that they would show a cartoon. At home there couldn't be a TV because the fear just got out of control. And again, so you see a mix between traditional and atypical anxiety. And when they looked at kind of, they also looked at sensory and sensory activity, especially hyperactivity, as well as language skills and kind of an anxious cognitive style. So someone who's a worrier, that predicted more traditional anxiety, and autistic symptoms and an anxious cognitive style predicted atypical anxiety. So there seems to be, in autistic individuals, there seems to be a link between sensitivity again and anxiety. And so this is also a question that I'm asking in a project that is funded by MQ and Autistica with my students Tim Russo and Karen McLennan. And we follow children over 3 years, and we want to know, is sensory activity linked to mental health and anxiety? So one study that was published last year by Karen McLennan in our group, we looked at sensory activity subtypes and anxiety subtypes in autistic children. We had about 40 autistic children taking part. We had a mix of parent reports as well as direct observations. And just in a nutshell, what we found was that parent-reported sensory, again, hyperreactivity was positively correlated or linked with specific phobias and physical injury fears. And this was also when taking autistic traits into account as well. So we didn't find a link between hyperreactivity and seeking, but between sensory hyperreactivity and anxiety. And the more sensitive individuals were to the environment, the higher specific phobias or physical injury fears were. So then kind of another question I wanted to ask, that's the last part as well of this talk, is the question was, which one comes first? So is it sensory activity? Is it anxiety? What is the relationship? And there are different models. So Shula Green, who I work with as well, she suggested 3 models in 2010. The first model is saying anxiety is before sensory hyperreactivity. And here in the model, it's on the right-hand side as SOR, so sensory overresponsivity or hyperreactivity. So the idea is someone might be anxious, they spend more time looking around the environment, looking for something, potentially attending more to sensory stimuli. And then the combination of attending to sensory stimuli and having difficulties regulating your emotions might lead to an overreaction to sensory stimuli and overreactivity. And then it's this vicious cycle. You're overreactive, you might avoid sensation, you might avoid situations and not learn how to deal with them. The other model is maybe it's sensory overreactivity or hyperreactivity first, and then you develop anxiety. So the idea is you have a very strong response to sensory stimuli, such as sounds, and then there are certain objects in the environment, such as a balloon, which might pop and give a sound. And over time, you don't not only like sounds, you might also become worried about a birthday party because there is a balloon, and you might develop a specific phobia, for example, to balloons. So to an object, even without the sound. And then because the environment is quite unpredictable and uncontrollable, that could be more developed with generalized anxiety. So that's a second model. Then there's a third model, saying that maybe it's a third factor. So there is a link between sensory overreactivity and anxiety, but there's a third factor that explains this association. So one idea is that the amygdala, for example, that's the area in our brain that is involved when we process fear, has been involved with anxiety, has been involved with overreactivity. So maybe that just explains where we see this link. And Shula Green then conducted a study in 2012 where they had about 150 autistic toddlers. They looked at sensory as well as anxiety at 2 time points. And you don't need to understand this figure, it's rather complicated, but basically on the left-hand side, you see time point 1 measures. So we measure the child's developmental level, the maternity anxiety, so how anxious are the mothers, anxiety at the time point 1, and then sensory overresponsivity, SOR, or hyperactivity at time point 1. And then they measured it again on the right-hand side, anxiety as well as overreactivity at time point 2, a year later. What they found was that anxiety increases over time, hyperreactivity, SOR, was stable, and also anxiety was predicted or was linked to the child's developmental level, the maternal anxiety as well as anxiety and sensory overreactivity at time point 1. So hyperreactivity predicted anxiety. However, it wasn't the same for the other way around. So anxiety at time point 1 did not predict over responsivity at time point 2. It was more that the more overreactive a child was at the first time point, a year later, they were also more overreactive. So that speaks a little bit more towards the model that potentially sensory hyperreactivity might precede anxiety. But again, this is one study in very young children, so we can't really generalize it. We did also ask autistic adults themselves, and when I say we, I mean mainly driven by Isabel Verhulst, my previous master student, where she was interested in the link between sensory activity and anxiety, but also in the perceived causal relationship. So we ask autistic adults, which one do you think came first? So we ask about, do you think you're hypersensitive? Are you anxious? And if someone was both, we would ask, to which extent does your sensory hyperreactivity, for example, cause your anxiety? And then you also ask, to which extent does your anxiety cause sensory hyperreactivity? And by doing this, by asking it both ways, you can see, is one more the effect or the cause of the other? And what we found was that there seems to be a bidirectional relationship. So it seems to be sensory activity and anxiety on an overall level seem to be both cause and effect of one another. However, if you break it down into subtypes, what Isabel found was that, and this was in over 200, I think 240, 250 autistic adults, we found that hyperreactivity seems to be more the cause than the effect of anxiety. And sensory seeking seems to be more the effect than the cause of anxiety. And a similar pattern was there for hearing, auditory, as well as touch, tactile. So auditory was more a cause than effect. And for touch, it was more an effect than a cause. So I think what's important here is that sensory hyperreactivity, again, seemed to be perceived as being there before someone develops anxiety. However, anxiety seemed to be there before sensory seeking. Even though there's a bidirectional relationship, one anxiety seemed to be there before seeking. And I think we interpreted that as to, and I like to hear your thoughts on this too, that sensory seeking can sometimes be used as a coping strategy. And one example of the other study we've done in autistic adults, where we ask about sensory experiences, can kind of show that potentially seeking out sensations can be quite useful and beneficial. So the example here is, I seek comfort in small things, such as a nice texture. I currently have a coin in my pocket that I hold when I'm nervous, so that I can filter the sensory environment. So potentially someone might be anxious and then they're seeking out sensations to calm themselves down. So again, the key implications, what I mentioned at the start, and hopefully they make a little bit more sense now, is first of all, sensory activity is very common in autistic individuals, about 80%. Anxiety is also common, about 40%. And there is a relationship between sensory reactivity subtypes and anxiety subtypes in autistic children as well as adults. Sensory hyperreactivity seems to be perceived to precede anxiety, whereas seeking seems to be more after and a coping strategy. And then also that kind of what is the kind of an implication, or what can we do with this, is that sensory activity differences could be considered when we are diagnosing anxiety as well as for interventions. And this could also be something for you if you're a parent, if you're an autistic adult, or also if you're not autistic, to think about your own personal sensory activity differences or preferences, and to think about how that might be helpful for you. So you could have your own sensory toolbox. There could be things that you really enjoy. So if there's a situation which might become overwhelming, you could be able to listen to music that could be calming and so forth. So there are different tricks that you could use potentially. And these are a few resources, and I think Autistica will share those with you, and also feel free to email me as well, or Autistica, and I can share some of these with you. So there are different books like How Does Your Engine Run or Sensational Kids by Lucy Miller. They're really interesting, I think, and they have also some tips what you can do at home, what you could try at school. The National Autistic Society and Autistica, of course, themselves have some links. A book by Sue Allen is quite nice. It's written from a child's perspective about sensory processing difficulties. There's a sensory integration network. For anxiety, there's a lot of work done by the Andy Clinic at the University of Reading and Kathy Creswell. And she has a book called Overcoming Your Child's Worries and Fears, which is basically talking you through different anxiety subtypes and things you can try to help your child. And my lab page as well, we have there's some information about our projects. And here is my email address, so t.tavassoli@reading.ac.uk if you have any questions, or if you have any questions now. And at this stage, thank you for listening. Thanks, Autistica, for inviting me, my students, who I think some might be on the call as well. Okay, I'll stop sharing my slides now. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Teresa. Really interesting to explore the whole realm of sensory differences. I think often the conversation can be around people being overstimulated, and when we hear about sort of autism-friendly things, it's all very much about dimming down things, and I think understanding that there's so much more to it than that is really, really good to hear. And obviously, the importance of understanding this stuff early, I think, really came through too. So yeah, as Teresa said, we've got some time now, around about 15-20 minutes for questions. We've got a few coming in. Do stick your questions into the Q&A button on Zoom, and if you're on Facebook, just stick them into the comments, and we'll try to cover as many as we can, and if we can't cover them all, we'll just try and cover a broad range of questions. So I've got one that's come in that's quite specific. It's sort of COVID related. Someone's asked about their daughter who really relies on a daily swim to manage her anxiety. And because of obviously pools being closed, she's kind of lost that sensory regulation. Is there anything you could suggest as a kind of replacement, or how you might deal with that kind of situation?
Yeah, so just first of all, as a warning, I'm not a clinician, not an OT, but I hear that quite a bit, like swimming seems to be quite nice. And we also saw that here water seems to be something that people might seek out. And what I would say is it's two things. First of all, it seems to be that the daughter is seeking out sensations, mainly water, and the swimming gives her an input which seems to be beneficial. And this could be potentially replaced by activities you could do at home. So this could be maybe swinging, or wall push-ups, or things you can try at home. And there's this book also, I mentioned it, it's called Sensational Kids by Lucy Miller, and they list different activities too. And for this one, for example, yeah, they say make tools available for heavy work like climbing a rope, a tricycle, bicycle, provide self-calming devices, fidgety toys. So in some ways, I think as a parent, you have to become kind of a sensory detective, and then you find out things that might be calming and that the children might seek out, and then you use these in situations where it's getting too much. That's kind of what I would say. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Question around the fact that there seem to be more people who are hypersensitive than hyposensitive. Do you think that's really a thing, or do you think it might be sort of differences in diagnosis, that those that are hyposensitive might be less likely to get a diagnosis because of their challenges might be less apparent, less obvious?
No, I think that's a really good question. And the figures I showed were mainly for self-reports, and that means autistic adults who were able to fill out questions on a survey. And often I think with individuals who are verbal, who are able to do all these tasks, they seem to be potentially more hyperreactive. But then there might be some individuals, for example, a few to no words, I think we see more hyporeactivity. So I think if you would use data from questionnaires, you would see a better fit, like you would see more individuals also being hyporeactive. And another thing is also, it might be harder to know that you're hyporeactive. So for hyperreactive, you're like, yes, I don't like this, I don't like this. But if you're not as sensitive, then you might just not pick up that you're not as sensitive. So I feel like it's harder to identify that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Another fairly sort of specific one here, and might be a similar answer to the swimming one. Someone's asked on Facebook that their 12-year-old autistic son doesn't like the feel of paper, so he'd refuse school tasks that involve writing. I don't know if that's something you've come across before. Any thoughts to help with that?
So in some ways, I would say it's always best to potentially get in touch with an occupational therapist, for example. They might have some ideas about what could you do. Sometimes I think it's useful to actually, rather than enabling a child or like just taking it out completely out of the environment, to slowly introduce someone to that material, like to paper. I mean, otherwise I feel a lot of the work right now could also be done on an iPad, so you can write on an iPad rather than, like, if it's paper itself. Yeah, I think potentially talking to someone how you could desensitize, or finding an alternative such as writing on an iPad or something else where you write with a pen. However, you don't need to touch paper.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think it's all about flexibility with anyone's learning, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how are you taking into account different levels of reactivity to the same stimulus with the same person sort of over time?
Take into account for research, you mean? Or
yes, yeah. Is your research study sort of taking that into account, that people's sort of reaction to a stimulus might change over time?
Yeah, so for my own research, I usually try to look at sensory activity in various ways, and then I create a composite score. So usually the times where we were still able to see participants and families, we would do a direct observation, but that basically only gives you an idea about that specific time in that specific setting. So we also interview parents about kind of generally how is your child reacting to things, as well as we're doing a parent questionnaire as well, or sometimes a self-report, if someone is able to do a self-report. So by taking into account different observations as well as questionnaires, I think we get a broader picture of someone's sensory activity. And someone it's not like if you score high on this, you have to score low on this. So someone can score highly on being overly sensitive to touch, but also can score highly on being hypo-responsive to touch, depending on, for example, in the parent interview, someone might say, oh, my child really doesn't like hot bath. They react very strongly to it. But then in the direct observation, we are presenting different stimuli and textures, and someone might be seeking these out. So you can, I think by doing this and the combination of assessments, you can get a better picture.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Quite a few questions sort of asking, I guess, where this research might be heading, where your research and other research like yours, what implications does this have for management, treatment? Yeah,
so I think, so there is, I didn't present this today, but there is also a line of research saying that someone who might be intolerant to uncertainty and might need the same thing over and over again, that is linked to anxiety. And that line of research actually led to different anxiety treatment plans. So where, for example, if someone doesn't have kind of traditional anxiety, where you can adapt it and take into account different traits that might be more seen in autistic individuals, such as intolerance of uncertainty. So you work on this, and that might help with anxiety. For my own work, I think the next step is, so we identified that different aspects of sensory activity, so hyperactivity as well as seeking, seem to be linked to anxiety. And I think there are two things. One is to take this into account when someone would treat an autistic child who is anxious, but also really potentially tap into the seeking aspect and see how can this help. So some of my future lines of research will test, I want to test different intervention trials to see what could we do if we help for sensory needs, and if we meet someone's sensory needs, will this also improve mental health? Also, I'm looking broadly at mental health. So some of the work, we also found that seeking seems to be linked to depressive symptoms as well. So I think there can really be, definitely has clinical implications, as well as for research as well, to know like what factors you need to consider.
Brilliant, good to hear. So someone's asked here around how they should manage sensitivities with their child. So should they be supporting their child to kind of get used to whatever those sensitivities are, or should it be about sort of avoiding them where possible?
It's a really difficult question, but there is a sensory guide that I think I shared with Autistica, and they would be happy to share with you as well, which potentially has some tips as well. Personally, I feel it's a fine line. So you don't want to expose someone to something they don't like and make them like it. I feel like that is difficult that would be difficult to do. On the other hand, sometimes it might also be, you shouldn't completely avoid something, because that could make the situation worse. So let's say a child is very sensitive to sounds. So in some ways you would want to take the sounds away and make it easier for the child, and put headphones over the ears so that cancel out sounds. That might help in that situation. However, you take the headphones off and then everything is even louder. So rather than saying you can't, like we stop sounds because you don't like them, you could try, is there any sound that that person likes? So for example, music. And then if you present music, then your hearing system doesn't get overly sensitive to sounds, if that makes sense. So so it's a fine line between, you don't want to avoid it, but you also don't want to expose to someone to something they really don't like. There was an interesting poster at one conference once, where they asked children, how much do you not like sounds? So on a scale from 1 to 10, there's a loud sound. How distressing is this? And the child would be like, maybe a 6. Then they also asked the parent, on 1 to 10, it's a 10. So it's always like, you need to really identify, like, how much is this a problem for my child? Is there something that we can do, for example, a sound like music that they might like, so to expose them to that, to not completely avoid something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was talking to someone that took part in one of your studies, actually, a parent, and she found that I think the school or the nursery where her child went were really encouraging her child to wear headphones all the time. And she's kind of, since taking part in the study, realised that nuance a little bit more, and has encouraged the school to kind of just leave them there as an option. But it's up to the child to put them on as and when they feel things are getting too much. So I thought that was quite a nice example. Okay, just having a look, some others that are coming in. Someone asking about a teenager. I think this is about navigating services, so I don't know how much you know about this, but for someone with a teenager with sensory sensitivity and anxiety, where would you suggest that they go? CAMS or a sensory occupational therapist? The parent here said that there doesn't seem to be much of an integrated approach or sort of guidance as to.
I really can't say a lot to this, because it depends so much per district, per region, per service. I think in the sensory guide that we have, we do suggest you should try to go through the NHS, through CAMS or occupational therapists. There are also private occupational therapists, but you will need to check that they have the right credentials and so forth, and that can be very expensive as well. But I think it would need to depend on where they are. Yes, but in generally, if it's a teenager who has sensory as well as anxiety, to try to talk to the doctor about it, and like the GP, and hopefully they could refer. Often, but again, that varies where you are. Here in Berkshire, often you would first start with kind of a workshop for parents, and a one-on-one is often harder to get. So it needs to be something that has a real impact on different areas. To get the referral. So I understand. I think we hear that a lot. It's really difficult. It can be really difficult. The sensory guide, I'm very happy to share, because there are also different stories about parents on what ways they went through, and there are different options basically. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll definitely share that guide. It sounds really useful. Someone's asked here around whether this is common, so this is maybe something that the person has experienced themselves, or maybe their child has, where the thing that used to calm the person actually becomes a problem in itself. So the very touch of the material that used to be quite soothing then becomes a problem, and the feel of the thing creates an adverse reaction rather than the soothing one. Is that something you've come across at all?
I mean, I know that's actually a good question. It can sometimes be in the time. Some anecdotal reports say if someone is tired, it's the response to the same material is very different than on another time. It could also be if the amount of control. So, for example, a hug is if you are the one saying now I want a hug is good, but if it's unexpected, so the uncertainty about it could play a role. Otherwise, it might also just be a change. So our preferences change over time. So that could be just something at one point they were seeking it out, but now it's just for some reason aversive. Yeah, I think it could just be developed over time as well. It's not like that it always stays the same. It's also that sensory differences seem to be very common between 6 and 9, like between the ages of 6 and 9, but they change over time because our kind of sensory systems and generally change as well.
Great, thanks. Oh, just trying to work out which I haven't asked yet.
Oh, also, sorry, there is, it reminded me as well about, so Connor Kearns developed this tool for anxiety, and there's also this question about someone might have a special interest that someone might really enjoy. So it could be playing computer games is hard. So many teenagers are like that, but let's say playing computer games. But after a while, a child can develop an anxiety and a fear related to their special interest. So something that is calming and is really liked by someone can become something that is bothering, and there can become a lot of fears, like when can I play this? Is someone breaking my computer? I can't get access to it. So it could be, especially if someone might have a kind of like a thinking style of coming back to the same question again, that something that was used to be beneficial can become negative for and very distressing. So that I think you see that kind of what was described here for sensory, you see that as well in more in autistic kids than in kids who are not autistic, for special interests in general. So I think that, so in some ways that might be common, at least common in other areas as well, that special interest in something that was really liked all of a sudden becomes distressing. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Facebook. How do you identify the cause of sensory-based anxiety in a child who isn't verbal?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. It's really difficult to identify sensory symptoms as well as anxiety in individuals who have few to no words, but you would go more by behaviors rather than someone mentioning that they're anxious. So for example, you could see, so when the child was younger, maybe 2-3 years old, we do see sensory symptoms already that might be even before they were diagnosed with autism or before they were anxious. And you would go by behavior someone is showing, so putting the hands over the ears rather than saying this is too loud, moving away from bright lights, always having a very strong reaction if someone is wearing yellow. So you would see, okay, there are some sensory symptoms. And then for anxiety, it's the same. So you can't, sometimes it's more difficult to say, is this anxiety or not, if someone can't tell you. But again, you can look at the behavior. So do they look distressed in the situation? Do they avoid, for example, going somewhere where there's a sound, there's a park, there's a dog, would they run away from it? So you look at the behaviors and something you can observe. And to know, is that the cause or not? I feel sensory is not the cause of anxiety, but I think it is linked to it, and potentially you see the symptoms before anxiety, but you might not be able to say one is causing the other, but it's more the idea that they are linked, and one might be, you can identify before you see anxiety symptoms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. Someone's asked here that the 5-year-old autistic child is both hyper and hyposensitive and to various inputs, and also seeking, so particularly visual stimulation, so phone, TV screens particularly seem to have a calming effect. Does the research, your research or other research, suggest that this is typical in autistic people and children.
Sorry, repeat it. Like, it was visual seeking as well as?
Yeah, so hypo, and
yeah.
seeking visual stimulation. So a real kind of a mixture. To some.
So yeah, no, that is very common. You have a mix of it all. And in one study where I worked with about 30 autistic kids, and the children were, I think they were 6 to 14, and they were some of them had few to no words, but the majority were verbal. And what we saw mainly for vision is seeking out. So for exactly this example, so vision, we saw most of the kids were seeking out sensations, but for touch and hearing, it was more avoiding and hyperreactivity. So I think particularly for vision, the seeking element seems to be more common. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. We're coming up to 2 o'clock, so just got a few bits to mention before we finish. But thank you so much, Teresa. Really, really interesting research, lots of detail there, but also really kind of practical advice as well. So thank you for answering all those questions. We've added quite a few links. Thank you. We've added quite a few links into the chat for people, and if anyone wants any further information that maybe bits and pieces that you missed, this is being recorded. It is going on YouTube within the next couple of days, so you can find the links back on the recording there. So just to say, for anyone that isn't already in touch with Autistica and receiving emails from us, if you're autistic, if you're a family member, or if you're a professional, you can join the Autistica network, and as a member you'll receive personalised updates on the latest research, and also opportunities to take part in studies too. So we've just put a link in the chat for that. We'd love to hear your feedback. We haven't done loads of these webinars, but we're looking to do a lot more. So we'd love to hear from you what you think worked, what you think didn't work, any comments that you have on future topics. We'd love to hear from you. So again, a link to the feedback form, which should only take a minute or so to complete. It'll be really great to hear from you. And finally, this week is World Autism Awareness Week, which is part of World Autism Awareness Month throughout April. And we're focusing on anxiety, and that's why we've focused on sensory issues on this webinar. We've also got other webinars coming up, and we're sharing lots of resources as well on our website. So we're including a link to the Autism and Anxiety Hub that we've created with various different bits of resources on there, and also a short video that we'd love you to share on your social media, if you have social media, to help the world understand a bit more about anxiety and autism. It's a really short introduction to many of the topics, including sensory and reactivity. And finally, being World Autism Awareness Week, obviously we're a charity. All of the research we do is funded by voluntary donations from the public, and we wouldn't be able to fund research like Teresa's or to run events like this without voluntary donations. This webinar has actually been sponsored by Fujitsu, but we obviously do rely on donations. So if you're able to make a small donation towards the research that can take Teresa's research into making a real difference and really shaping sort of services of the future, we'd love a donation. So however much you can give, whether it's £5, £10, every small amount really helps to make a real difference for autistic people. So the link is also in the chat. But thank you very much for joining, and hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you. Bye-bye.